Being held, I heard one, there were two people looking at the program, and I heard one say to the other, "Oh, Jack Knetsch, I didn't know he was still alive." That's how difficult it was to get stuff published back in those days. Well, this has changed. It's changed a lot. And it's changed, by the way, in sort of an interesting way, that the sort of top journals were the first ones to start publishing papers in behavioral economics. The sort of second and third tier journals, I think, were frankly scared of it and didn't want to be shown up to do stuff that really wasn't credible. So once the top journals started accepting it, then it sort of became okay for everyone else to do it. So I was a lucky beneficiary of this because I got some papers published in top journals that way that probably otherwise wouldn't have made it. There is another part of the story, though, in the sense that while people write about it, and there's a lot of research going on about it, in my view, it isn't really being used very much. Now, there's an exception in behavioral finance, that the people who deal with investors, decisions, and stuff like that, they are very keen to do research and to use the results of research. Outside of that, for example, in environmental economics, it's simply not on. If you insist on using some of the results of behavioral economics in environmental policy, you're not going to be invited into the house anymore, in a sense. You're just not. It's just not a credible thing for environmental people. And this is unfortunate, I think, because we're missing the opportunity to have much better environmental policy than we're pursuing. So we're all paying the price for this, in my view, obstinance on the part of environmental economists. Same thing, I think, is true of many other fields of economics. That we talk about it, but we're simply not using it. So let me give you a few examples of that. But before I do, I think there's also another problem, and that is the way we do economics these days, the way we teach economics these days. And the example I like to use, and some of you have seen it before, is a study that Paul Ferraro and Laura Taylor did a few years ago, in the early 2000s. They set up a little table at a meeting of the American Economics Association in the U.S. Now, if any of you have ever been to that, it's in my view, a bit of a zoo where you have about 3,000 economists running around trying to get jobs, trying to talk to other people, and so forth. And while it's fun to run into old friends, it's just otherwise a pretty painful experience to be among 3,000 economists in a hotel in New York or someplace like that. Anyway, what they did was to set up this table and invited people, they had a sign, invited people to come by and answer a single question. The question was a end of chapter question out of an intermediate micro textbook. You know, not a very sophisticated question. Had to do with opportunity cost. Now these were people, almost all of whom had a PhD. They were either professors or graduate students looking for a job or whatever. But, you know, professional economists at that level, by and large. So they had 200 and some people stop by and answer this question. Again, not a sophisticated question, just a little question having to do with opportunity costs. It had something, I didn't put the whole thing, but essentially you had a ticket to a concert and then you really had another alternative and so forth. You ended up saying, what's the opportunity cost of seeing Eric Clapton's concert? And it was a multiple choice question in which they offered 4 possible answers. And those are the distributions of the answers across the floor. And what's rather remarkable about it is it's a complete disaster. 25, 21, 25, 27. You can go out on the street out here and ask 200 people and get a better distribution than that in terms of the right answer. They have no clue what the opportunity cost of that ticket was. These are people with a PhD in economics. Now, what's going on? Well, I think what's going on is the way we're teaching economics these days. What we've done is to almost guarantee that no one has any economic intuition once they've finished an economics program. And I think that's very, very telling, but also very sad, and I think very unhelpful. That if you don't have any economic intuition, you're really not going to be able to do any very much good. You're going to be a great colleague because people who get stuck like I do on some technical point, I can run down the hall and talk to you and get straightened out. But you're never going to be able to do the kind of economics that I think needs doing. I think there's a real problem with the way we're doing economics, and I think it shows up right there. By the way, that was repeated in Nankai University in China. I was working there, and one of the graduate students took it upon herself to survey a bunch of Chinese economists. And the answer was, she was interested, are Chinese economists as bad as American economists, basically, was what she was interested in. And the answer is yes, they are as bad. She got the right answer to be up to, I think, 27 or 28%, but basically the same results. To get back to behavioral economics, is really, I'm not particularly hung up on any definitions of things, but behavioral economics, as you probably are aware, is sort of, we look at insights from psychology and economics and other decision sciences and so forth. It was really psychologists that started the movement, and then there were a few economists who sort of thought this is pretty interesting, myself included, Dick Thaler and a few others. And we started looking at the same thing, and Dick Thaler and Danny Kahneman, happily, we ended up working together for a couple of years on various things. I'll show you some results of that. As you're probably aware, Danny Kahneman, who is a psychologist, very famous psychologist, won the Nobel Prize in economics. It's also true that Danny has never had an economic course in his life. And he used to borrow textbooks from me and read them, and then on Monday morning ask me questions about it. So every Monday morning was an interrogation by Danny about economics. And we first met when we were a PhD committee of a student at the University of British Columbia. And he and I met there, and as we walked out the door, he turned to me and said, "Do you people really believe that?" Because we've been talking about what economists do and so forth. Let me give you some examples. Okay, you'll see in the literature on behavioral stuff various kind of labels for different effects or way people think and so forth. Don't pay too much attention to those. They're sort of, things run into each other. There's seldom one thing or another, but people tend to give them labels. And let me give you a few examples here. The first one, in terms of things we observe, is that people, let's say you have a choice of investing, or people invest in two kinds of companies. One is a company, and they both make profits. And one company declares dividend and gives the profits, or a good share of the profits, to the shareholders. The other company, and so consequently people invest in it, get a stream of income in the form of dividends. Other companies don't distribute dividends, or don't distribute very much money in dividends, but in fact reinvest it in the company itself. And the company grows, and therefore the shares of the company you own increase in value because the company is getting more value, right? So you can imagine two companies equally profitable, one paying dividends and the other not paying dividends, but increasing in value. The shares increasing in value. Well, you would think that people ought to be indifferent in terms of which of those two kinds of companies they invest in, because they're equally profitable, they're making the same amount of money both ways. Now, there are tax differences in different countries, to be sure, but basically the idea is you ought to be pretty well indifferent. Well, what we find is, particularly among retired people who are using this for income purposes, we're finding a huge bias. The bias is, of course, they want dividends. Because if you get a dividend check, you go out and spend it and not feel bad about it. If you don't get a dividend check, the only way you can get any income from your investment is to sell some of the shares. And people hate to do that because it feels like you're selling away part of your capital. So it feels like you're losing money. I know that because I do that myself. I will not sell, I'm very hesitant to sell shares of companies, but when a dividend check arrives, hey, let's go to dinner. I have no problem at all spending that money. Well, it turns out that's a very common feeling among investors. It's not just people like me. Second one, they're decoupling purchases from pay. Now, the most successful example of that, of course, is credit cards. That people have much less difficulty buying things on credit using a credit card than if they had to pay with real money, right? And credit card companies around the world make a lot of money based on exactly that difference. So if you can decouple having to pay for something and actually getting it, people are much more inclined to spend. There's an interesting example of that in terms of policy, and it has to do with the great engineering achievement of these automatic road toll collections. Different countries implement these. The one, I go to Singapore quite often, and Singaporeans, as you would expect, have this really neat system of road collections. You're going down the street, and where there's a road collection, there's this thing, arch across the road. You drive under it, and it automatically deducts money from a thing that you put near the windscreen. Right? And if the main purpose of a road toll is to get people to act differently, that is, not drive when it's crowded and take alternative routes and all that sort of thing, these automatic road collections almost totally defeat that, because you feel nothing. I've taken it to, just jump an instant in, when I'm riding with friends or people and we go under a road toll, I look at the driver to see if there's any reaction whatsoever, and there never is. Sentences are completed, nobody pays any attention. They just paid a toll of whatever, $2.50 or whatever. But there's very little deterrence as a result of going through this. So I think while the engineering is wonderful and the convenience is certainly there, I think one of the prices is that we have, people don't feel any kind of deterrent effect. So I think we're undermining the deterrent effect of road tolls by this wonderful engineering. Some cost effect, another example from Singapore, but I think we all have them, is Singapore used to have, and they still do have, but it isn't quite as bad as it used to be, a huge purchase tax by an automobile. The idea being that they wanted fewer cars on the road because otherwise they're going to have congestion and it's going to look like Jakarta, other places in Southeast Asia. And so what they wanted to do was to cut down the number of cars. So they put a huge purchase tax on cars. A friend of mine bought a Honda Accord some years ago, and we happened to buy a Honda Accord almost the same time. We paid something like $23,000 Canadian for that car that we bought. The car that he purchased in Singapore was almost identical, and he paid the equivalent of something close to 150,000 Canadian. We paid 23, he paid something close to 150. That's how high the purchase tax was. Well, what people do in places like Singapore when they pay that much for a car is to do what? If you paid all that money for a car, what are you going to do? You're going to drive the bloody thing, right? And so consequently, instead of keeping cars off the road, you're putting cars on the road. You don't really care whether people own a car. What you're really worried about is that they drive the car. They take up space on the road. That's what you're worried about. Well, if you have a high purchase tax, you may deter some people from buying it, but the people who do buy it, they're going to drive back and forth all the time. Some of you are probably aware that the per capita, the distance driven per capita or per car in Singapore is one of the highest, if not the highest in the world. People in Singapore drive more than people in a country like Canada, which has nothing but space. And the reason is, they just drive all the time, back and forth. Because in part because there's a huge sunk cost effect going on. So in spite of large investment in public transportation and so forth, people drive a lot. Avoid debt. We have a program in British Columbia, the province in Canada where I live, that allows people when they get to be, I think it's still 60, but it may be now 55. Anyway, when they get to a certain age, they no longer have to pay property taxes. Now, property taxes, a lot of jurisdictions do that, but in our case, I pay taxes. I pay income taxes and all that sort of thing. But I also pay a tax on the value of my property. And the property, my house, or like in our case, a condo now. This money goes to the local municipality to pay for the streets, the schools, garbage collection, water, sewer, just our local services. And the amounts are not trivial. They're several $1,000s a year. And it's tied to the value of the property. Now, what was happening in Vancouver is the same thing that's happening in so many cities, I suspect Bangkok included, is that the value of property has just gone very steeply up over the last decades. So the people who bought property in Vancouver, say in the 1960s, may have paid $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000 for a house. It may now be worth over $1 million. So the complaint is that people, usually on fixed income, are living in a house worth $1 million, but they don't have any money to pay taxes. So they're not poor, but they don't have any money. So there was a money flow problem with it. So these people were complaining to the government that they were forced to move out of their house that they had been living in all these years, raise their families, the usual sort of complaint. So the government came in with a solution, which I thought was actually very, very clever. They said, okay, you don't have to move. The province will pay the local municipality taxes for you. So if you want, you can go down, sign a piece of paper. You don't have to pay any taxes. The province will pay the municipality, so they have money to fix the streets and so forth. And when you sell, or if you die, the estate sells the property, then the money will be paid back to the province. And the interest rate, by law, is something like a percentage point below the borrowing rate of the province. So in principle, you could do this and take the money you save, buy government bonds, and make a small profit, in principle. So the interest rate is very, very low. And you would think that everyone who got to be 60 years old would take advantage of this. It's a good deal. You can't possibly lose on it, right? When we became eligible, I signed immediately. Everyone who I know who is an economist also signed up. Everyone I know who is not an economist has not signed up. The percentage of people in British Columbia who are eligible, who take advantage of this program, which looks like a totally good deal, is less than 3%. And it's not because people don't know about it. They know about it and they don't want to do it. Why? Because it feels like a debt. They paid off their debt, the mortgage is gone, this feels like a mortgage. In fact, it is. And they don't want to take it out. So they'll be strapped for money for the rest of their life or the rest of the time they're there, but they won't take advantage of this program. And in fact, there was a split vote on it in my household. Patricia, my wife, was adamant that we should not do this for exactly this reason. And I've told some of you before. She's not a, she's had to live with the economy for a long time. That's probably the problem. No, my final argument to her, which it seems not to be important. There is one, of course, that people want to make sure that they can leave something to their heirs. But the amounts that are at issue here, it's only property tax on $1 million house, so that it's not going to affect it. Probably the appreciation of the house, at least over the last couple of decades, has overwhelmed that. But there is, you're right, there is some of that, but that seems not to be the motive when we talk to people. Overwhelmingly, when you talk to people, it's this: I don't want to go into debt yet. I started to say my final argument to my wife was that I've had more economics courses than she has, and I think it's a good idea. I recommend highly you never use that argument. It's not a winner. Okay, the power of default is enormously powerful. Just give you some examples there. That in some countries, there are a lot of evidence to suggest that people throughout the world think that organ donations are a good idea. A lot of organ donations are live donations, as you're aware. People giving a kidney, usually to a relative, but sometimes not. These particular numbers concern not living donations, but from people who have died, usually by accident, but not necessarily on it. So when they run surveys and ask people whether they think this is a good idea that organs be used for transplants for people who need them, overwhelmingly, 80–90% in most countries think it's a good idea. But countries have different rules in terms of the default. In many countries, US, Canada, and many others, unless you make it known that you want to donate your organs, then it's presumed that you do not want your organs taken after you die. Other countries have the opposite thing, where it's presumed that your organs can be taken unless you make it known that you don't want that to happen. And you see the difference in the number of people who don't end up donating. If it's an opt-in, very few people opt in. If it's opt-out, very few people opt out. So you get a huge difference in the number of organs that are being donated. And in Canada, it's kind of frustrating because every once in a while the people running these programs appeal to people to sign up to donate their organs. Never once have I seen it mentioned, why don't we change the rule on the thing? I think changing the rule would be a whole lot easier way of dealing with the problem than trying to talk people into it. There's an automobile insurance problem, the second one there. In one, this happened a few years ago. In one state in the U.S., New Jersey, the default, there were two states coming in with an automobile insurance package. In New Jersey, the package, and they were almost alike except for the default. In New Jersey, it was slightly cheaper, but the benefits of the insurance were smaller. You couldn't claim certain kinds of losses. In Pennsylvania, you could, but the premiums were slightly larger. And people in New Jersey, well, they both stayed with the default. In New Jersey, the default was the cheap one. They stayed, 80% stayed with the cheap one. In Pennsylvania, the default was the expensive one, and 75% stayed with the expensive one. So again, whatever you set up as the default, people stay with it. They just don't want to make the effort or whatever, even if the effort is very trivial, to make it change. There's also now a lot of work being done on pensions and saving for retirement around the world, because it's a very serious problem in many places. And again, what they're finding is companies or organizations or government agencies that set up a default that when you come to work, they say, this is your salary, this is how much is going to be contributed on your behalf to your pension fund. Do you agree, or do you want to change the amount? Versus, here's your salary, how much do you want to put in your pension fund? And they get a huge difference in the take-up. So if you have a default where it's automatic that you're going to subtract a certain percentage, people go along with it. But if you give them the option of say it's zero unless you want to contribute, basically, then they don't. And the arguments, of course, are all too familiar to most of us. If you ask me how much I want to contribute, I'm likely to say, well, I need the money right now, but later I'll contribute a lot more, make up for it. And of course, people don't. And so we're running into the kind of problems that we're all aware of. Okay, this is getting into things that are sort of more in the area of the experiments that people have done. This is one, I've left out a lot of the numbers, but I'll tell you what they did. These were people who were MBA students at, I think, Northwestern University. Very good MBA business school in the US. So presumably, these are reasonably good people. And what they did was to ask them to take out of their wallets, billfolds, their Social Security card. It's kind of comparable to an identity card in many countries. And ask them to write down the last two digits of their Social Security card. And in the US, the Social Security card, the last two digits don't mean anything. They do mean things in other countries, I know. They're totally random numbers, and everyone knows they're random numbers. So they asked them to write down the last two digits. Then they asked them to say how much, the most that they would be willing to pay for various kinds of consumer items. A box of chocolates, a book, a cordless mouse, a bottle of wine, and I've forgotten what the other two were, but there were 6 items, right? So, and it was for real. They actually had to pay real money, and they got these goods. And I won't get into detail of how they actually did this. Anyway, these people said how much they would be willing to pay for a box of chocolates, the most that they would be willing to pay. The whole table shows exactly the pattern of the mean for all 6. Those people who had a small last two digits, the last two digits going from 00 to 19, on average were willing to pay $11.25. People with a somewhat higher discount rate, last two digits, were willing to pay $17, and so forth. you can see this going up. So that the top ones, the people with the highest numbers, were willing to pay for the same items an average of $32.99. It's obvious, right, that there's no connection between the last two digits of your Social Security number and how valuable you think a box of chocolates is. Yet, look at the numbers. And that kind of experiment has been repeated over and over. When I started working in this area, I just couldn't believe that people would do that. So I ran some anchoring experiments myself. I can drag any one of you anywhere I want to with an anchor. It is amazing how easy it is to get people to anchor on something and to make decisions based on that anchor. When it's clear, there cannot be any connection between the two. My favorite example is a study that was done a couple of years ago by someone.
The anchoring is because you ask this completely nonsense question about the last two digits.
Yeah, but I can do it. I've done it, for example, by saying, would you pay $50 for some environmental purpose, we'll say. And then I'll say, if you say yes, then I say, would you pay $100? Versus someone else, I say to them, would you pay $100? And if they say no, I go down to $50. So I create an anchor by the first question, and I get a very different response to that. Yeah, well, with this one. I know. No, that's why I say it's so easy to get people to anchor, even when it's obvious it shouldn't happen. But let me tell you about my favorite one here. He divided the group into two, and he asked them to take a pencil, a piece of paper. Half of the people, he asked them to draw a line, I think 3 inches long, about this long. This is American, it's inches. And the other, and they did, and to draw it as straight as they could. So they would draw this 3-inch line as straight as they could. Then he asked these people to draw a line as straight as they could, 6 inches, I think 6 inches long, twice as long. Right? Then he asked all of them, these were Americans, how long do you think the Mississippi River is? Right? The Mississippi River. Okay, all Americans know the Mississippi River is a long river, but no American, I don't think, has a clue how long, right? So they all had to make a guess. And what he found was the people who drew the short line guessed shorter than those people who drew the long line. Now that's my favorite anchoring experiment. It's about length.
But Social Security has graduated.
I know. No, anchoring is it's a fun thing, but it's, I have no idea why people. He ended his article, by the way, in saying that the next time he had a student evaluation of his class, he was going to hand out very long pencils to all of the students to answer the stuff, answer this evaluation. Okay, free. Turns out we all like free. We like it a lot. This is an interesting experiment in which, in the top, he had a bunch of people, they in this case actually, offered them a choice of buying one or the other of 2 pieces of chocolate. One was a Lindt truffle, and if anyone knows anything about chocolate, you realize that a Lindt truffle is really, really good. And 15 cents for a Lindt truffle is a good deal. On the other hand, the other one, Hershey Kiss, you're probably also familiar with. That's the one they wrap in silver thing. And to be charitable, it's not nearly the quality of the truffle, right? it sort of tastes like chocolate, but not much. And he offered these two, and 27% took the Hershey Kiss, and 73 knew a good deal when they saw it. 73% took the Lindt truffle. Then he had a different group of people and did the same offer, except he changed the price by 1 cent. So the Lindt truffle, instead of 15 cents, is now 14 cents. But the other, the Hershey Kiss, instead of 1 cent, is now 0 cents, free. Suddenly, the free became really, really attractive. The power of free is extremely strong. Give you another example, tells you more about me than you want to know, is my wife and I used to live near a park where there was a lot of great hiking trails. There was a swinging bridge over a very deep canyon and things like that. A very attractive park. And we lived quite near it and went over there quite often. Went hiking and so forth. And they had a little nature thing, anyway, where they have dioramas of the history of the area and animals, natural history, and so forth in this little building. And they had pamphlets on describing the area and so forth. And they had a small charge to visit that. I can't tell you how small because we never paid it. We went very often to this park. It was probably 50 cents or something like that. And even Canadian professors can afford 50 cents, right? And but we would go into the park and we had to walk right past this thing. And every time, one or the other of us would say, "Should we go in?" And the other one would almost always reply, "No, we don't have the time today. Let's do it next time when we have more time." That was our rationalization. And of course, we never had time. We never went into that thing to look at it. One day we went to the park and we happened to notice that the sign said no entry fee. We had time. So we had time every single time after that to go into that building. It was really interesting. We spent time there, and we'd go in and say, "Wow, this is nice. Let's see what they've done this time." We always went in. But when there was 50 cents, we'd never went in. That tells you more about me than you want to know. But I think it's not uncommon. I think this is very, very common behavior. The power of free is pretty strong.
I have a question. Is it the same phenomenon as ending a price with 99 cents instead of $1?
I think it's related, that same idea, that $1.99 instead of $2 or whatever, yeah. It feels like a lower price and somehow a bargain or something. I think it's related. It's not exactly the same thing, but as I said before, I think these things aren't sort of neat and clean. They sort of run into each other. I think this is a case of that. Sorry?
The first speech is 0.
Yeah. I think that's going on. So I think there's several things going on, but what obvious, your example is an obvious one, and people do it all the time. Particularly if you can, $9.99 is a whole lot cheaper than $10. We all know that. If you have to add an extra digit, that really is a thing. But by the way, if you have any questions, let's make this, just raise them or so forth. Let's make this a little as informal as we can. Okay,
Let me ask you one.
yeah, sure.
I've been to the U.S. consumption tax, sales tax, is always added on to the price. Whereas in Thailand, the VAT is included in the price. In that case, the logical thing that they want the people to pay is that they are paying.
Yeah, that's very deliberate, and there's usually a lot of argument about it. Because if you're trying to discourage people from buying something or using something, you want to make sure that they realize that there's a tax that they're paying. If it's part of the total, then it takes away most of the deterrent effect. So buying something that's $2.99 here and then getting to the cash place and then realizing you have to pay more, a much bigger deterrent effect.
No, it's also the feeling that by lobbies against big government or something like that, people are made to feel the taxes.
Yeah, they feel the tax. They feel the tax much more when it's not included in the price. Yeah. Now, to separate it, they usually do it because they want people to feel it, like cigarettes or things you're trying to discourage the. If you're trying to discourage people from buying something, that's what you want to do. You're right that it also makes people aware that the government is getting this money. That raises something I want to talk about in a few minutes, though. What happens to the money they collect turns out to be important. But I want to come back to that in a second. Okay, one that I could talk about for about 4 days now, but I won't. It's the area that I've been working in mostly, and that is the difference that people, different value people place given the measure. What I mean by that is, when we want to know the economic value of something, our definition of economic value is the maximum amount that people are willing to pay for it. But there's a second definition that's equally valid, that's hardly ever used, and that is, it's the minimum amount that people demand to give up something. So if you're gaining a glass of water, then how much are you willing to pay for it is the measure of its economic value. If, on the other hand, you already have the glass of water and I want it, the value that you place on it is the minimum amount that you would accept to give it up. These are both standard definitions of the economic value of something. What we've always assumed in economic theory, standard theory, is these two numbers are going to be the same. And those of you who've done economics, this is an obvious point. That is, absent an income effect, let's say it's for some trivial item like a glass of water, then how much you're willing to pay for it will be almost exactly the same as the minimum amount you would demand to give it up. And that's what economic policy has been based on for generations. We all know that. We all grow up with that assumption. We know it's true. Until some people started asking whether it was true. And it's not. And we should Henderson in 41, we should normally expect the results to be so close together, it wouldn't matter which one you use. So when you see people doing any kind of economic analysis, what they do is typically use how much people are willing to pay to avoid losing something, for example. The right measure of a loss, of course, is how much they would accept to give it up. But if we know they're the same anyway, what's the difference? So economic practice has for generations simply ignored this issue because we've assumed it away. We thought there's no reason why you you should not be willing to pay the same amount that you would accept to give it up. It just sounded reasonable. Well, people, particularly in the environmental area, started asking, doing surveys, and what they found was that they weren't even close. That when you are giving up something, people demand a whole lot more than they're willing to pay for it. Now that came as a big surprise to everyone, well, to all economists, but to no one else. And it just seemed to non-economists is pretty obvious. Why are you people so surprised? In fact, I've had people, when I started working in this, ask me why I was working on this. Because the economists said it can't possibly be true. We've always known that there's a difference. And my non-economist friends would say, why are you working on that? It's obvious that it's true. So it's sort of two sides of this. So,
I
yeah.
noticed that the second code read with all of the comments.
Well, that's probably where it belongs, actually. Anyway, people started doing some studies on this, myself included. I'll just give you a couple of examples. This is a laboratory experiment done by a couple of accountants, actually. A paper from the American Economic Review. What they did was ask the same people how much, they reversed the order of the two, half of them. They asked people how much they would pay to get a lottery ticket that would give them a 50% chance of winning $20. And as you see there, they were willing to pay $5.60 on average. Then they gave people that lottery ticket, said how much would you demand to give it up? What's the smallest amount of money you would take to give up your lottery ticket? A number slightly bigger than twice as high, $11.02. That's typical of what people have found in now literally hundreds of tests that. One that I ran a long time ago. I gave one group of people a choice between two simple goods. One was a coffee mug, and the other was a 400-gram Swiss chocolate bar. And asked them which one they wanted. And they simply picked one or the other. That was it. And as you see, about half of them took one, half the other, slightly more taking the mug, which I don't understand, but that's what they did. I happen to like chocolate much. Second group of people, I gave them all a chocolate bar. And then said, if you like, you can give back the chocolate bar and we'll give you this mug. And there were 6 people in the room. All they had to do was sort of raise their hand. Transaction costs were very, very low, in other words. And as you see, 90% of them stayed with the chocolate. Third group of people, I gave them all a mug. And same deal. If you like, you can give back the mug and we'll give you a chocolate bar. 89% said no thanks. They stayed with the chocolate bar, the mug. In other words, giving up something meant more to people than giving something. So the day they told you that opportunity cost is the same as real cost, forget it. Sorry? These were.
No suspicion.
No, sorry. These were 3 different groups.
Has anybody tried, because it may be due to the fact that they suspect, now that they have the chocolate, it's theirs.
Yeah.
They suspect there's maybe something wrong with the last.
They may have. Looking at me, they may.
Somebody could do an experiment.
Yeah, no, we have done those kinds of experiments.
No, which is, transparent. That it's the same man, and it's the same chocolate.
We've done that. They are the same chocolates. And we sometimes pile them up in front of people. Sometimes we give them there are literally hundreds of variations of this, so I think we've covered it. People just value something they have more than things they don't have. And I think most people in this room feel the same way. I certainly do. It's, I'm reluctant to give up something even though something I value. Anyway, let me show you some other examples that may allay your fears. These were so-called laboratory experiments, which is a common thing that behavioral people do. But increasingly, we're also turning to what are called either field experiments or natural experiments. They're slightly different. These are three so-called natural experiments. And the first one, in terms of research questions, there's some really interesting, I think, implications that I first studied. This was a study done by Dan Putler, a marketing guy. This was a PhD thesis, actually, and Danny Kahneman was on his committee, which helps explain what he did. He looked at the price sensitivity of eggs. Now, the price of eggs in most markets, retail markets, tend to fluctuate quite a bit. You go into the shop one day and the price of eggs is this much, go in the next day and the price of eggs is higher or lower. So lots of price differences, price changes. So what he did was to calculate the price elasticity. It is the sensitivity of the quantity that people buy to the price. Now this, as all of you who are economists know, this is price sensitivity, price elasticity is a big deal in economics. It's a very important thing that we want to know about. So is something sensitive to price changes or not sensitive? How elastic is it, we call it? So what he did was, what we normally do is to collect data on prices of commodity and the quantity sold at that price, another price, quantity thing. We get a whole bunch of price quantity observations, right? And then we fool around and do some econometrics with it, control for this, that, and the other thing, and calculate price elasticity. Standard thing we do in economics. And it's used for policy purposes for all kinds of things. Agriculture, commodities, it's a big deal. Energy, it's a huge issue. What is the price elasticity of energy commodities? Because we base an awful lot of public policy on the sensitivity of price on various kinds of energy outputs. So this is how we calculate. What Putler did was to divide his sample between observations where the price had increased and observations where the price had decreased. Right? Because if there's this gain-loss business, then a price increase feels like a loss. And maybe people have a different reaction than when the price drops, which feels like a gain. So given the kind of data we've been looking at before, a price increase, if it's a loss, people are going to, maybe not buy so many eggs, or not buy eggs at all that day. If it's a decrease, gains are okay, but they're not a big deal. So they may buy roughly the same number of eggs, right? So what Putler did was to test that proposition. As you see, there was a huge difference. People, when the price of eggs went up, they were very, very sensitive to that because it was a loss. People are much more sensitive to losses than they are to gains. So you got an elasticity of 1.1. When he looked at the observations of price quantity after a gain, people were pretty insensitive. They didn't really care that there was a drop in price because gains don't matter that much to them. So we got an elasticity calculation estimate over twice as high for the one and the other. And the mystery to me is why people haven't followed up on that study. I know of one study where somebody basically did the same thing for, I think, lettuce. Unfortunately, I can't find the citation to it, so I can't tell you where it is. But I do remember reading. far as I know, no one has followed up on this. Why aren't we interested in this? I mean, if we're so interested in price elasticity, why aren't we interested in an issue that has such a potentially dramatic effect on that price elasticity? If we're worried about energy policy, it seems to me we ought to be sensitive to this. If there's this kind of difference, we're talking about an increase in energy prices or a decrease in energy prices, we better know about it. Why aren't we? I have no idea. This is one of those kind of research questions that I just can't believe people aren't jumping all over. There have been a lot of citations to Butler's paper, which was published in '92. I think half of the citations are citations that I've made to that paper. I've been talking about it for 20 years. And I've tried to get people to get it. I'm not an econometrician. I don't pretend to be able to do this. But I certainly would like to work with an econometrician to do something about this. There are all kinds of data that we can find out for all kinds of commodities. You can use scanner data for things that people buy in terms of groceries. You can get all kinds of data on energy pricing because this is a big deal in the world, and people collect this data. Why aren't people worried about this? Why aren't people doing it? Seems to me this is a research question just waiting for people to do, and we need it. This is be not only very interesting and publishable in a good journal if that's what you're interested in, but it's also something the world would benefit from knowing. Anyway, second one is that people are reluctant to realize losses. And Odin got a hold of I don't know how he did it, but I talked to him about it, and he's pretty close-mouthed about how he pulled this off. But he got records of thousands of retail investors, and the records of buying and selling of shares of companies. Thousands of them over a period of something like 7 or 8 years. And what he found was that when people hold shares, the value goes up. They sell and take their profits, no problem. When shares go down, they're very, very reluctant to sell their shares because then they have to realize that they've lost money. So investors tend to hang on to losers too long and sell winners too soon. And he calculated that bias that people do, that the shares that they sold on average increased 3.4% more than the ones that they held. In other words, they held exactly the wrong shares. Had they sold the ones that had gone down and kept the ones that had gone up, they would have been much better off. And I do this, and every other person I know does this. We're all reluctant to sell shares that have gone down in value. That's right. But in my case, I have a good reason for it because I know those shares are going to come back. But I'm an economist. I know them. Right. Okay, the last one is kind of a fun one, but I think a very telling one. This is a paper that was published in the American Economic Review, I think 2 years ago. And one of the arguments that people have made that don't like this data is that, well, who cares about a mug? It's only worth $5, and people don't put in the kind of care to make those kind of decisions, or it's one time, if you repeat it, it'll go away, and all this sort of thing. Neither of which there is any substantial evidence is true, but I think this one really deals with everything. What these people did was to get a hold of the records of the Professional Golf Association, which I had no idea existed. But on the Professional Golf Association, largely North America, but I think in includes some European tournaments as well. Every single stroke, of every single golfer is recorded. How far it was, how far the shot went, whether it went into the trees, whether it stayed on the fair, all of that is recorded. They record the temperature, the sunshine, the rain, everything is recorded. I can't imagine, and this apparently goes back for decades on it. What they did was to see whether golfers putted differently for to prevent a loss or to achieve a gain. If they're on the green in 2, let's say it's okay, par. Those of you who don't know what I know. Par is sort of the standard. A really good golfer is supposed to be able to get the ball in the hole in par. So if it's a par 4 hole, you're supposed to go from tee to get the ball in the hole in 4 strokes. A birdie is if you do it in 3. If you do it in 5, that's a bogey. So bogey means you're above par, birdie means you're below par, right? So.
Now I understand. Thank you.
To be more realistic for most of us, including me, a double bogey is 2, for a triple bogey, anyway. This is for people like me, quite well. Anyway, what they found was that, and tournaments are won or lost on the basis of total number of strokes, not how you do on individual holes. Right? It's the total number of strokes. So after usually 4 rounds of golf, whoever has the fewest strokes to go around all 4 wins the tournament. What they found was that when people were on the green in 2, that is a tee shot and then another shot, put them on the green, then they were putting. That's when they bend over with the shorts. Okay. Those who don't know. When they're putting to put it in the hole, they're trying to get a birdie, 1 below par. That's a gain. On the other hand, if they're on the green in 3, they're putting to save par, to prevent a loss, because if they miss, they get a bogey, that's 1 above, right? It should not matter what they're doing, right? They're trying to get the least number of strokes for the whole tournament. It mattered. They were much more accurate preventing a loss, putting to save par. They didn't want a bogey. Bogey felt like a loss. Birdie sounded like a gain. Gains are not as important as losses. So consequently, they putted more aggressively, more accurately to save par. Now these are people who do this thousands of times a week, right? They do it for years and years and years. Hundreds of thousands of dollars are at stake. So we're not talking about a $6 mug, we're not talking about a one-time off. This is repeated by people who, that's what they do. They interviewed professional golfers and showed them the results of the study. Every one of the golfers they talked to, these were the pros on the tour, said, well, yeah, of course. They were not at all surprised. They said, we don't want a bogey. So they knew what they were doing. They knew it was costing them. It was costing them, on average, about a stroke, either a round or a turn, I forgot. And they calculated how much more money they would have earned had they not had this bias. And in the amount of hundreds of thousands of dollars. So this is a real experiment in that sense. So this is not anything in the laboratory. This is taking real records of people. There's a new study that hasn't been published yet that I think also makes some case. And it gets into a policy issue. There's a great concern in a lot of countries. This one happened to be done in the U.S. John List, Steve Levitt is the guy that wrote Freakonomics, that maybe many of you are familiar with, and 2 other people who wrote it. Anyway, what the concern is that children are not achieving very good results in terms of learning, our small children in elementary school. So there's a real concern that schools are not teaching kids as well as they should. So there's been talk in a lot of places, in the U.S. in particular, I would expect, what if we paid bonuses to teachers on the basis of how many of their students pass a standard test? In other words, pay them for teaching better, is the idea. So provide a cash incentive. Now, you hear that similar kind of programs discussed in many countries these days that provide more incentive for teachers to provide better teaching. So what they did was to run a very elaborate experiment, I think a very expensive experiment. The bonuses range from $0 to $8,000 per teacher. So this is not a trivial amount of money. If a teacher is able to get more of their students to pass this exam, they could earn up to, I think it was $8,000. And they had hundreds of teachers over 9 schools in Chicago. What they found, and they had 3 groups of 3 treatments. One was simply a control. No bonus for, no bonuses were paid. So normal teaching. Second one was they gave a bonus for for every student that passed at the end of the year, they got a bonus. That's his exam. Right? What they found was paying people like that had almost no effect. There was a slight positive effect, but no statistically significant effect. So it was small and not significant. It was positive, but small and not significant. So paying teachers didn't really do that much. But they had a third treatment. The third treatment was they gave all of the teachers at the beginning of the year the full bonus, assuming that all of their students would pass this exam. Then at the end of the year, when the students took the exam, all the students who did not pass, the teachers were required to pay the bonus back. Yeah. In other words, they were put into losses for every student that didn't pass. Now, standard economics would predict there should be no difference, right? Because you're getting more money the more students pass the exam. Whether you get it and then have to pay it back for the ones that don't, or get it for the ones that do, shouldn't matter. There was a huge difference. When teachers were faced with the prospect of having to pay back, they did everything possible to make sure that they didn't have to do it. Whoa. They should have the same incentive. They should have the same, by standard economics, they should have the same incentive to do the same effort for those students. You're right. That should. Yeah, what they did, they put in more effort when they were faced with the prospect of having to give the money back. Then they put in a lot more effort because more of them passed. Many more passed. It should be symmetrical, but of course isn't. Just think about it. If you've gotten the money already and now you have to pay it back, exactly. I want to keep the money. I don't want to lose it. No, they're all being paid on the basis of number who pass or don't pass. That's the same. That's the payoff is when they pass, and you have to pay it back if they don't pay it back. No, I mean, I don't know about you, but this feels very real to me. If I have to pay the money back, yeah, it's the same thing going on. People, a foregone gain doesn't feel nearly as bad as a loss, and there's an asymmetry between them. This is sort of just what's going on in terms of, we normally say a gain, okay. Is there an arrow down there somewhere? I'm out of range. No. Okay, this is quantity of whatever, money, health strokes, and so forth. And this is some sort of value, utility, welfare, and so forth. And what we normally assume is that the more you have of something that goes up on some curve looking like this, what all of this data is suggesting is that people have a reference point here, which may be the status quo or maybe some expectation or something. And this is a real problem. We don't really know enough about the reference point. Beyond the reference point, it's good, but isn't that good. But below the reference point is really bad. There should be more of an inflection in that curve. And one of the issues, and really one of the areas of research that badly needs work on, is trying to figure out where people's reference point is. Well, let me give you an example to illustrate this. Say that people commute from one place into a city every day along a particular roadway. Every day they make the commute, go back home and so forth. There may be congestion, whatever. One day a lorry overturns, spills a bunch of things along in the roadway and blocks traffic. Is that a loss to people or a foregone gain? Well, I think most people would say that's a loss. They expected to get home in a certain time, and now they are to work in a certain time. Now they don't. So they feel in the losses. So now they're sitting behind a pile of whatever was on this lorry, and the question is it worthwhile cleaning it up? So do a benefit cost kind of calculation. We want to know how much value they place on getting rid of the thing so that they can proceed. So what's the value of cleaning it up? Should we measure it in terms of how much they're willing to pay to clean it up? Or should we measure it in terms of how much should they be paid not to clean it up? In other words, where's the reference point? If the reference point is it's clogged, you can't pass, then the proper measure is willingness to pay. If, on the other hand, the reference point is there's not supposed to be stuff on the road, then the proper measure is how much you have to be paid to put up with it and not have it cleaned up. Well, I think in that simple example, most people would say the reference point is getting rid of the stuff. It's not supposed to be there. Yet, the way we do benefit cost analysis, the way we do policy analysis generally is to assume that the reference point is having stuff blocking the road. Even if it's, a truck suddenly overturns one morning or something like that. In other words, we tend to do a lot of policy stuff using the wrong measure of gains and losses. And if the difference between gains and losses are the kind of thing that I'm suggesting here, this is very, very serious. What's the value of cleaning up pollution? Is it how much people are willing to pay to get rid of it? It is if pollution is the reference. But if pollution is not the reference, but people expect the air to be reasonably clean, then the proper measure is, and there really isn't any doubt about this, the proper measure then is how much you have to pay people not to clean it up. So if we're serious about environmental stuff, by and large we're using probably the wrong measure. But we don't know that until we know where the reference is. But I think people can already make a reasonably good argument that people's reference is reasonably clean air. Even if they've never seen clean air in their life, it's probably reasonably clean air. Because pollution seems to be an aberration on what would be a normal or expected condition. But we don't know this. This is why it's such an interesting research area that I think builds on the kind of observations we have. So I think this is a very, very important research topic, and people are starting a little bit to pay attention to it, but not much. Well, let me quickly run through a couple of other areas and suggest some other research questions. One is the area of
this is the same that the outcome it should be the same as possible.
yeah, that's
So there is a risk element there.
they dealt with risk.
Consider
Yeah.
some consideration of the reference point is status quo.
It may or may not be. See, the reference point, let me give you another example. The reference point may not be the status quo. Let's say that I'm standing here, I came in and expecting to talk, and somebody grabs a hard object and comes up to me and starts hitting me on the head with it, which I didn't expect. No, disagreement, yes, but not somebody hitting me on the head with a hard object. Now, am I in the lawsuits? Yeah, because my reference is not getting hit on the head with a hard object, I think. Now, if somebody comes up and stops that person, is that a gain to me or is that a reduction of a loss? I think most of us would probably agree that's a reduction of a loss, because my reference is not getting hit on the head. So the status quo is being hit, but if somebody is going to stop that person, that's changing it from the status quo to something. So it'll often be the status quo, for sure. But I think we can come up with all kinds of examples where it probably wouldn't be. But at the end, we just don't know that.
Risk means that you are undertaking action which has a risk move from status quo before you take an action.
Yeah, well, Kahneman and Tversky dealt with risk initially, but what we've done since then is to get into riskless, and the same sorts of things apply. There are, however, some really interesting risk questions that I want to come to in just a minute. One which I find very puzzling, but also very interesting. Let me very quickly mention some areas that are also, I think, important for public policy. And that is, we know more about fairness than I think we're using. When you ask economists about fairness, we almost always mutter something about income distribution, that poor people should not be disadvantaged and so forth. And that's about all we ever say about fairness. But in fact, we know a lot more about fairness than that. And fairness is very, very important to people. And these are just some surveys that Kahneman and Taylor and I did years and years ago. It's the only thing, by the way, that economists generally thought of approvingly that we did. Most of them thought most of the stuff we did they didn't like gain losses and things like that, but they did like this. Okay, the first one was, you can tell how long ago we did this. It was Cabbage Patch Dolls, and probably no one in the room knows about Cabbage Patch Dolls anymore, but this is a very popular toy back in the mid-'80s, and it was so popular that shortages developed all over the world, and there were all kinds of things going on where people try to get a Cabbage Patch doll for their kids. Anyway, the story went that we said a store is sold out of Cabbage Patch doll. They suddenly discover they have one, and they decide to hold an auction and sell it to the highest bidder. Do people think that's fair? Overwhelmingly, they said no. Then we changed the question. Everything was the same, except we said the store will not keep the profits, but they'll give away the extra profits to charity. Then it's okay. We had a whole lot of several questions like that, and our conclusion was it's not fair if one party gains at the expense of another party. But if this party loses, but this party doesn't gain, then it's okay. Second question illustrates this. If housing is scarce and the landlord raises the rent, is that fair? No, because the landlord's going to make more profit now at the expense of the tenant. On the other hand, if the expenses go up to the landlord, can he pass on the expense to the tenant? Yes, because now the landlord isn't benefiting. Last one was wage. Can you cut workers' wages? No. Can you cut a bonus? Yes. Bonus feels like a foregone gain. A wage cut feels like a loss. These are the kind of things that we found very consistent patterns across people all over the world and across situations, contexts. I think we know a lot more about fairness than we're making use of.
The wage and bonus thing, there is a different ratio. A wage cut is cut forever into the future.
Yeah.
Bonus is a one shot. It's possible.
We set it up, no, we actually set it up as a bonus is paid every year. It's like Singapore. And we said this year they're getting cut. And we still got it. By the way, this is important for macroeconomic policy because one of the problems of macroeconomic management in countries, as you're probably aware, is getting wage flexibility built into your economy. When there's a downturn in the economy, what you want to do is to be able to cut wages. Of course, workers don't like their wages to be cut, so this is very hard to pull off. But in Singapore is a good example, if a large portion of workers' income is in the form of a bonus, you can fool around with the bonus, and that's okay. And if you tie the size of the bonus to the performance of the economy, as they've done in Singapore, that makes it even easier. So there's a lot to be said for for introducing a bonus system to get wage flexibility built into your economy. Gives you a big advantage. Labor unions, of course, appreciate that, and that's why they fight it. But in Singapore, as we all know about Singapore, they pull it off.
About this event, there was a survey about psychologists in New York, right after the fall of the Soviet, so that they would kind of possible difference between Moscow and New York. And they found out, for example, that raising the taxing fare when it rains is highly unattractive. Is not okay in both Moscow and New York. I think it's the same direction.
Yeah. That study actually made use of some of our questions. And I can't think of the authors who did it, but they knew about our study and used some of our questions on that same study. There's a whole issue about deservedness, but let me go on. Let's skip that for now. Okay, how to put this up really to illustrate how research in behavioral economics, I think, this is a model of how I think it can be done. A lot of early behavioral economics research, my own included, centered on trying to demonstrate or test to see various things that people did that was not consistent with standard economic theory. So a lot of us spent an awful lot of time, selling mugs and stuff like that, showing that people didn't behave the way economic theory predicted. I did this for a number of years, and personal story again. I would go to the Canadian economics meetings every year, present another experiment showing that people were doing this sort of thing. And everybody thought, this is funny and laughed and so forth. But I had a friend who came up to me after one of these presentations and said, "Jack, that's all very interesting, but so what?" This is what good friends are for, is to pull you up and say the obvious thing that I should have realized. So what? What does it matter that people play these games incorrectly and this sort of thing? So not only did my research change, but I think in general the whole field of behavioral economics changed. Much, much more effort was then shifted towards not just demonstrating more, people like free or people like this or that or anchoring things, but how can we solve real problems? And this, I think, is a good example of what I mean by this. There was a real problem. There continues to be a real problem in many countries, the U.S. included. UK is certainly another one that's has a big problem, where workers are not saving enough, putting enough into their pension schemes so that when they retire, they're going to have a standard of living that they expect or want. So I referred to this a bit earlier. So what happened in this particular case was a company in Chicago, I don't know the name, and Dick Thaler has never told me, and frankly I've never asked, came to him and said, "Dick, we've got a problem. When our workers come to work for us, we hire a worker, we tell them what their wage or their salary is, and then we ask them how much of their wage or salary they want to contribute to their retirement fund. And then we will match it or whatever the deal is on it. And they are saying numbers like 0 or 1% or 2%, something that we know will not provide them an income when they retire anywhere close to what their standard of living is now. So you know something about behavioral economics. Can you suggest anything that we could do to encourage people to contribute more to their pensions?" So Dick started then with a problem. See, I was starting with, how can I demonstrate some foolish behavior on the part of people? He started with a real problem. He and Bernardsey, the guy who works for him, thought about it, and they met with the people and said, "Look, the way you're doing it now is probably the absolute worst way. It's going to encourage people to come up with the smallest number, because what you're doing is you're saying, here's what we're going to pay you. How much do you want to pay back? In other words, we're asking you to give back something that you think is yours. So we're imposing a loss on you. People hate losses. They're going to not want to contribute very much. Why don't you think about doing this instead? Not a loss, but turn it into a foregone gain." And what they came up with was to tell the workers this: "Look, this is your salary or your wage. In a year, there's going to be a review of that salary or wage, and you'll likely get an increase in your pay. How much of that future increase do you want to put into your pension? It isn't money out of your pocket today, it's less money in the future." You think about it, it feels very, very different. You can see the difference it made. Before, the average contribution was 3.5%. When they introduced this change, it went up almost fourfold to 13.4. Furthermore, it stayed there. Furthermore, Dick has now traveled all over the U.S. working with companies to implement this. He's done it for hundreds of companies now. Hundreds of thousands of workers are now on this scheme, and the story is always the same. And Dick tells it it's probably the best thing he's ever done as an economist. But notice what he did. Here's the problem. What do we know about economics or behavioral economics or anything to help with the problem? And he was able to use some of the, not only economics, standard economics, but some of the behavioral insights that we have and improve on it. That's, I think, how we ought to be proceeding. Is not the way I was doing it, the way everyone else is doing it, just looking around for things to do in terms of demonstrating some behavioral quirk. But this is a real problem. It's how we should do economics. Behavioral economics is just more economics. It's not a different economics, it's not an alternative to economics. It's just doing economics with a little more insight on how people actually behave. As Dick says, it's doing economics with a higher R squared. I think that sort of captures the intent. Let me, two quick things I want to mention before we wind up. One is, economists love Pigouvian taxes. That we think that if people do things we don't want them to do, if we raise the price out, they won't do it so much, and so forth. So road tolls, pollution taxes, name it, these are all Pigouvian, so-called Pigouvian taxes, right? Great economics. People hate them. Ask the former Prime Minister of Australia how people like Pigouvian taxes. They lost the election on the basis of a tax, right? The carbon tax that they implemented. People in Australia, put in a news account from our paper. Much of the blame for the loss of the election by the government was attributed to the carbon tax. Voters have never stopped hating the tax and its effect on their electric bills. So people really hate pollution or any kind of Pigouvian tax. People don't like road tolls, and one of the reasons is, again in Singapore, where they have a very extensive system of road tolls, I have a habit of asking taxi drivers and friends what they think of the electronic road pricing in Singapore, which is their automatic road tolls. I have yet to have a taxi driver explain that this is a tax which is equal to the marginal social cost of the delay of traffic and so forth. Not a single taxi driver has given me that rational explanation of what a toll is about, right? Every single one, and furthermore, every single economist I've asked has given me essentially the same answer. It's just the government money grab. They're just taking money out of our pockets. No thought that this is payment for the externality caused by driving on the road at that particular time and so forth. There's no connection. People don't see the connection between the two. Furthermore, there's the issue that was nicely demonstrated by Yuri Ganesi and Rosicini. May be familiar to some of you at least. What the deal there was, it's a universal problem all over the world with daycare centers. A daycare center is when parents have children, they drop off the children in the morning, go to work or wherever they're going for the day, come back by a prescribed time, pick up their children, take them home and do whatever they do with them. The problem is people get hung up at work. Sometimes are late. And the daycare people are stuck with a few kids every night because the parents don't show up on time to take them home, right? So you can't just leave the kids on the street. Somebody's got to stay there with them. So this is a real problem. A daycare center in Israel, I think in Jerusalem, saw that this was a problem and came up with a solution. The standard solution that economists always come up with. They put a fine in the place, right? Raise the price. That'll fix them, right? They'll show up on time because nobody wants to pay to show up late. What happened? more people showed up late. Not fewer, more people showed up late. Why? Two reasons. First one was, before, people felt very bad if they showed up late. But it happened. You can't get away sometimes. But there was a moral obligation to do the right thing. The right thing was showing up right on time. So they felt very bad, personally very bad, if they didn't show up on time. So there was a moral sanction at work, which is very powerful. Once you said, it's okay, you can come late, or this is how they interpret it. It's okay, you can come late, just pay us a little money. Now you can just pay, no more moral sanction. I just pay. Now it's not a fine, it's a price. I'm just paying for the right to come in.
It's the price of babysitting.
It's the price of, yeah, that's right. They're just simply paying the going rate. So, and afterwards, by the way, the second reason was that the fine was in fact fairly low. But the problem was that was interpreted by people as, well, this is no big deal. It's only $1 an hour, or 10 shekels an hour, whatever the fine was. In other words, when you have a low fine, people interpret it isn't worth much. So if you have a low toll on the highway, on the roadway, people are saying, no, that's not that big a deal. If the toll is only $1.50 to go from here to here, that means I'm only, this is reading into it, but basically this is what's going on apparently. Well, just because I'm driving here, okay, I'm slowing everybody else down, even if they went that far, but it's not worth that. That's not causing that much of a harm because I'm only having to pay $1.50. If it was a serious problem, they would charge me $20. It's obviously not a serious problem, so it's only $1.50, so the sanction is diminished. What happened in the daycare is they realized the error of their ways. Right? Okay, this didn't work. More people showed up late after we put the fine in, so they decided to do away with the fine. Didn't work. People kept coming late because now they had destroyed that moral sanction and it wasn't coming back. So they really messed up by following the advice of the economists. Not the first, nor the last time that's probably going to happen.
What do you suggest they do?
We start with whether they have kids or not. Let me come to that.
I mean, they put part of the story that we have to pay labor time.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think one of the sort of the story I'm coming to, what we need to do is to make the real cost salient to people. And I think we've done a terrible job of doing that with everything, from pollution taxes to road taxes and so forth. These are, in the minds of people, totally arbitrary numbers. That's why when I ask people, how do you like road pricing in Singapore, they said, it's just a money grab on part of the government. I think there are a couple of issues in this. Yeah. There are actually two issues. People don't respond to higher taxes very well. In other words, if you put in a road toll of $1 and then you raise it to $1.50, you get almost no difference. Again, people don't see that it's tied to anything. It's totally arbitrary. But I think there's something else going on here. And that is the whole issue of using money to guide behavior or to influence behavior. The whole idea of going in taxes. And there's the phrase "money can't buy." That's from the new book by Michael Sindel. Is that familiar to any of you? I would highly recommend reading it. particularly if you're an economist, but even if you're not an economist, it's just a fun read. It's how the world has been changing to use money for everything. And there are many things that people object to the use of money for. And that's influencing how we design public policy and so forth and so on. He said, one of the problems of pollution is people have a feeling that somehow you shouldn't be able to pollute just because you can afford to pay some money. Or you shouldn't be able to go on a road just because you have some money. Or one of my favorites examples that he has in his book is in the US there are certain prison systems where apparently if you're sentenced to serve time in a prison, you can pay to upgrade the facilities in your prison cell. In other words, yeah. So you're sent away for doing some horrible thing, and you have to spend, years in this prison cell. Well, prison cells are not very comfortable. They're not supposed to be comfortable, right? They're being punished. But if you pay, you can get a nice bed, you can get a shower, and so forth, and television in your room apparently. So this, and he says, this strikes many people being a little strange. So this is the tone of his book. Michael Sindel, by the way, if you are not familiar with him, he's a philosopher. He's been teaching at Harvard for many years. He teaches the most popular course taught at Harvard. And I've seen a picture of his lecture hall. It looks more like a football stadium than it does a normal lecture. It's this huge thing. People lined up, standing all over the walls. People can't get in, but thousands of people are not allowed in. There simply isn't any room. They can't get into his class. It's an enormously popular course that he offers. And it's all about justice, what's the right thing to do, and so forth. The earlier book on, I think it's simply called Justice or something like that, Michael Sindel, S-C-N-D-E-L, I think. That was his first book, and that's basically his course. And the second book is a new book, relatively new book, What Money Can't Buy. And it's a fun read, but also something that economists ought to take much, much more serious. The quotes I have there, that economists tend to look at Procopian taxes, this is just the cost of business. Pollution, we want people to pay pollution taxes because this is a cost of doing business. You should pay it. Well, non-economists tend to say, well, that's just paying to pollute. And that's not a good thing. So we have this conflict, and this is why the Australian election, I think, went that way.
Going back to the in a way, there is an argument of what public finance is, if you say the cost for us, and the cost is to not to us, the cost is to the people working. If you bring your kid, you have to pick up the kid, you're fine. You have to pay overtime the people themselves, not to us.
No, I think you're absolutely right. The point is, I think this is one of the things we have to include in the design of public policy. Now, we all know when we study economics, particularly if we study public finance, or if we work for a Ministry of Finance anywhere in the world, earmarking is one of the big evils of the world, right?
Great no-no.
Hmm?
It's a great no-no.
Big no-no. Everywhere in the world. economists say it's a bad idea. Ministries of finance get very upset when you talk about earmarking, for good reason, right? Because you're collecting money. Earmarking means dedicated funding. If you're collecting money from a road toll, you should, if you use that money for roads, instead of just turning it into the general revenue fund, you may or may not, that may or may not be the best use of the money. So it could be very inefficient. I'll give you a quick example. The U.S. for years has had a tax on hunting guns and firearms and bullets and shells. The idea was that hunters, when they bought a gun to shoot deer, pheasant, to go out and do this, or anglers catching fish had the same deal. A tax was placed on guns and fishing equipment. Part of that money went to fund habitat protection and fish propagation and stuff like that, so that they would have more pheasants to shoot and more fish to catch and so forth. Part of that money was also dedicated to research on these issues. I knew about that, and I was running a research center at George Washington University at the time, and I needed some money for some research. So I knew that these people had money because they had these dedicated funds, earmarked funds. So I went in and asked them for some money, and they asked me how much I wanted, and I think I said something like $20,000 or $25,000. Back then it was a lot of money. Their reply was, "Could you use 50?" They had so much money stacked up from this earmarked funds, they couldn't spend it. And if I would take more money, that would help them a lot. I've never had anybody do that to me since. But that's the problem. They had so much money. Why did they have so much money? Not because there were so many people interested in shooting pheasants and rabbits. Every gun sold in the U.S. had this tax, including pistols that people bought to shoot each other in downtown Chicago. That's where the huge increase in the tax revenues are coming from, was the proliferation of guns on the street. Thousands of guns were being sold back in the 60s and 70s and so forth. And they had all of this money coming in. They couldn't spend it. That's why ministries of finance hate earmarking. That's an extreme example. But people like earmarking. This is just an example of, we did a little study in British Columbia where we asked people who were using provincial parks. The government was thinking about increasing the fees to use the park. Did they think that was a good idea? No, they hated it. Why would they want to pay more to use a park? Then we changed the question to other people and said, we're going to raise the fees, but all the money that they collect, they're going to use to improve and maintain this very park. Wonderful idea. Changes where the money goes. This other one was a study done a few years ago on collecting road tolls. If they use it to general funds, people didn't like it. This is on a scale of 1 to 7. But if they use it for public transit, new roads, decreased fuel taxes, and abolished road taxes, then it's okay. So dedicated funds, I think, is one of the things that we ought to consider. But I think what we need to do is to really build these behavioral findings into the design of public policy. Why ignore it? Why don't we take advantage of, just like the Taylor Bernardsey thing? Okay, if people hate paying out something, why don't we say you're going to pay it for a future increase? Make it a foregone gain rather than a loss. If they like dedicated funds, let's say we're going to dedicate the funds to some purpose. There's a study that was done on getting rid of the subsidy of energy in Indonesia. When the government said they were going to reduce the subsidy, people hit the streets. They came out near riots. they looked at the possibility, what if we take the savings from reducing the subsidy, which they badly need to do, and use it for a purpose that people like? Would they then be much more agreeable? The answer is yes. So again, building these kinds of insights into public policy seems like almost a no-brainer in the sense, if we know things are much more palatable or much more acceptable, doing it this way, why wouldn't we do it? So I think this is how I see the future using behavioral stuff, is actually building it into things. This is one last puzzle. And I put it in terms of tax compliance because that's a problem around the world. But the real problem is how to deal with risk. Now, we have known for years and years, and I found this quote going back to some Garcia in 1764. Crimes are more effectively prevented by the certainty than the severity of punishment. Now, remember what economists say about deterrence. Deterrence in terms of crime things is based on the expected loss, right? The probability of getting caught and the sanction times the sanction. So the expected loss. So a criminal stands outside of a bank, decides, is it worthwhile going in and robbing the bank? How much money is there to be gained? Well, what's my expected loss? What's the chance of getting caught? What is the severity of the crime? That's what economists say is the deterrent effect. There's a whole literature based on that, right? What the psychologists and other people are telling us is, one, they don't weigh the probability and the sanction equally. It's not expected loss calculation. That the probability is far more important to people than the sanction. So the last one, a 1% increase in the probability of punishment increases the deterrence more than a 1% increase in the severity. That we know. But we also know that in things like health and so forth, catastrophic losses, environment and health and things like this, that people focus on the possible outcomes and are almost totally insensitive to changes in the small probabilities. In other words, when you're talking about crime, criminals presumably worry about the probability and don't care about the size of the sanction. But in health and environment, people worry about the opposite. They worry about the sanction or the big event. And you can double the small probability or triple the probability and it doesn't matter. There's lots of evidence suggesting it. And the question I have is, why? Why in one area do we worry about the probability and don't care about the size of the sanction, and the other is exactly the opposite? We worry about the size of, the spread of cancer, the wiping out of species, or whatever the thing is. And we're almost totally insensitive to the probability. And I've asked all kinds of people all over the world who make a career of worrying about risk, and I haven't had anyone come up with any clue as to why that is. So I've come to TDRI this morning for somebody to quickly inform me so I can quit asking a silly question. No, I think it's a real puzzle. And I have no idea why that is. But there must be some reasonable explanation. I just don't know what it is. So let me leave you on that. And maybe by after lunch somebody can clear this up. Okay. I sort of talked for a long time. Tried to give you sort of an overview of some of the things that are happening in behavioral economics, but I think more importantly is how you can use it and why it's worthwhile looking at. And we could do stuff, improve policy. I'll leave it at that.